The cameras had stopped, the tuxedos were rumpled, and the real parties were just getting started. Old Hollywood glittered with champagne, but behind the scenes it ran on whiskey, gin, and vodka. Studios sold an image of elegance, yet many of their stars lived in a haze of hangovers, bar fights, and all-night binges. Some drank to escape the pressures of fame, others to feed the larger-than-life personas that made them legends, and sometimes the industry poured the drinks for them. From Errol Flynn's rum-soaked parties to Richard Burton's marathon vodka sessions and Judy Garland's lonely nights with a glass in hand, these stars didn't just sip, they lived and died by the bottle. Today we're pulling back the curtain on the drinkers who defined Hollywood's golden age. Not the polite cocktail hour stories, but the wild, messy, and unforgettable truth. If old Hollywood had a poster child for reckless indulgence, it was Errol Flynn. On screen, he was the dashing hero of Captain Blood and the adventures of Robin Hood, all charm, swordplay, and adventure. Off screen, he lived like his characters, but with far more rum and far fewer rules. Flynn grew up in Australia and claimed he'd been expelled from every school he attended. By the time he reached Hollywood in the mid-1930s, he was already a seasoned partier. His drink of choice was rum, not just in a glass, but soaked into bread for what he called rum sandwiches. These fueled legendary parties at his Mulholland Drive mansion, where guests might include fellow actors, musicians, and complete strangers he'd met hours before. It wasn't just casual drinking. Flynn thrived on chaos. There were bar brawls in Beverly Hills, drunken boat trips along the California coast, and nights so wild they blurred into days. During one film shoot, he was so hungover he could barely stand, forcing the director to shoot him sitting down in multiple scenes. His drinking also played into his scandals. In 1942, Flynn faced highly publicized statutory rape charges. He was acquitted, and the trial coverage cemented his bad boy reputation. Instead of hiding, he leaned into it, coining the phrase "in like Flynn," a wink to his notoriety. By the 1950s, his health was collapsing. Years of heavy drinking combined with drug use and a fast lifestyle aged him well beyond his years. Friends said he looked like a man in his 70s, though he was only in his 40s. On October 14, 1959, Errol Flynn died of a heart attack in Vancouver at just 50 years old. The coroner found the body of a man decades older, ravaged by cirrhosis and hard living. For Flynn, alcohol wasn't an occasional escape. It was the fuel for his persona, the companion at every scandal, and the silent co-writer of his legend. Richard Burton wasn't just a great actor, he was a great drinker. Born in Wales in 1925, Burton grew up in a coal mining town where hard drinking was practically a cultural rite of passage. By the time Hollywood got hold of him in the 1950s, he was already deep into a love affair with alcohol that would last his entire life. Burton was magnetic on screen, earning 7 Oscar nominations for roles in classics like Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf and Beckett. But off-screen he could match and often outdrink anyone in the business. He was known to put away 3 to 4 bottles of vodka a day, sometimes starting before noon. Colleagues said Burton's drinking didn't just loosen him up, it made him sharper and more charming, until it tipped over into slurred, unpredictable chaos. His relationship with Elizabeth Taylor only magnified the drama. They were one of the most famous and most tempestuous couples in Hollywood, and alcohol was often in the middle of their fights and reconciliations. Their yachts, villas, and hotel suites became the backdrop for marathon drinking sessions that could last days. Burton once admitted he'd gone years without a single sober day, saying, "I have to think with a drink in my hand. I can't do it any other way." Despite repeated attempts to quit, including hospital detox programs, Burton always returned to the bottle. Friends described him as a man who feared sobriety because it meant facing his own insecurities. The alcohol gave him confidence, but it also robbed him of his health. By the early 1980s, Burton's liver was severely damaged, and his once legendary good looks had faded under the strain of decades of abuse. He died in 1984 at just 58 years old from a cerebral hemorrhage, his body worn out from years of heavy drinking. Richard Burton's talent was undeniable, but so was his thirst. In the end, he was as famous for his drinking as for his acting, a tragic reminder that in old Hollywood, the bottle could be as seductive as the spotlight. Judy Garland was the voice of innocence in The Wizard of Oz and the girl who dreamed of a place over the rainbow, but behind that sweet image was a woman whose life was quietly unraveling, fueled by a toxic mix of alcohol, pills, and the crushing demands of Hollywood. From her teen years, MGM executives controlled every aspect of Judy's life. They decided when she could eat, how much she should weigh, and even when she could sleep. To keep her thin and working long hours, the studio handed her pep pills to stay awake and barbiturates to fall asleep. This constant chemical push and pull set the stage for her lifelong addiction struggles. By the 1950s, Judy's dependency had expanded to include alcohol. Drinking became her way of numbing the pain, both physical and emotional. She was dealing with failed marriages, scandals, financial ruin, and a studio system that had discarded her after she was no longer a box office guarantee. Friends said that when she wasn't performing, she was often drinking alone, slipping into deep bouts of depression. Despite the turmoil, Judy's talent never left her. Her live performances in the 50s and 60s were legendary, but backstage she was often unsteady, and promoters would worry if she'd even make it to the stage. When she did, she poured her entire soul into the music and sometimes crying mid-song, and audiences couldn't look away. Her final years were a whirlwind of concerts, debts, and health scares. She married for the 5th time in 1969, but just months later, on June 22nd, she was found dead in her London home at only 47 years old. The cause? An accidental overdose of barbiturates. Alcohol wasn't listed as the direct cause of death, but it had been a constant companion in her struggles. Judy Garland's story is one of the most heartbreaking in Hollywood. A child star forced into addiction by the very system that made her famous, and a woman who turned to the bottle to cope with a lifetime of exploitation and heartbreak. Long before Hollywood scandals were blasted across social media, W.C. Fields was making headlines the old-fashioned way, with a drink in hand and a one-liner ready. Known for his raspy voice, bulging eyes, and deadpan delivery, Fields was one of the first movie stars to turn his drinking into part of his public persona. On screen, he played the lovable curmudgeon, a man who hated kids, loved liquor, and somehow stumbled into chaotic adventures. Off-screen, well, he wasn't exactly acting. Fields was notorious for starting his mornings with a breakfast martini and ending the night with whatever was left in the bottle. He reportedly kept a flask hidden on set, sometimes even in his prop scripts, so he could take a swig between takes without breaking character. While his drinking was legendary, it also became a liability. Directors would plan shoots around his hangovers, and co-stars sometimes had to pick up the slack when Fields was too under the weather to deliver his lines. But he was so naturally funny that studios kept calling him back, hoping to catch lightning in a bottle, or at least Fields sober enough to perform. In his later years, the drinking caught up with him. His health declined, and he became increasingly reclusive, spending much of his time holed up in his home with a bar that never closed. When he died in 1946, many fans mourned him not just as a comedian, but as one of Hollywood's last great eccentrics, a man who lived exactly as he pleased, no matter the cost. W.C. Fields' name is still shorthand for a certain type of booze-soaked charm. He didn't just drink, he made drinking part of his legend. And in old Hollywood, that was a role he played better than anyone. Peter O'Toole was the kind of actor who could dominate a scene without raising his voice, and dominate a pub without spilling a drop. Bursting onto the international stage in Lawrence of Arabia, 1962, O'Toole quickly became one of Britain's most celebrated exports. But behind the piercing blue eyes and regal diction was a man with a liver that could rival a seasoned sailor's. O'Toole once admitted, "I did quite enjoy the old vodka and tonic, but the vodka and tonic enjoyed me a bit too much." That was an understatement. Tales of his drinking escapades became almost as famous as his performances. He was known to drink through the night, show up to set with a mischievous grin, and still somehow deliver performances worthy of awards. His bar companions were a who's who of Hollywood and theater: Richard Harris, Peter Finch, and Richard Burton, a drinking club so notorious that bartenders in London and Dublin still tell stories about them. O'Toole's style wasn't sloppy. He could be roaring with laughter one minute, then quoting Shakespeare the next, all while balancing a glass in his hand. But his drinking came with a price. By the 1970s, his health began to suffer, and doctors warned him that he wouldn't live to see 50 if he didn't slow down. In true O'Toole fashion, he quit, only to return later, albeit more selectively. Despite the health scares, he lived to 81, a miracle by any medical standard, and perhaps proof that sheer charisma can keep a man alive. Peter O'Toole left behind a legacy of iconic performances and outrageous stories. He was proof that in old Hollywood, talent could sometimes outshine even the most destructive habits, but the habit would still make its mark. Ava Gardner was the ultimate Hollywood bombshell, the woman Frank Sinatra left his wife for, the smoldering star of The Barefoot Contessa and Mogambo. But behind the sultry screen image was a woman with a hard partying streak that rivaled any of her male co-stars. Ava wasn't the type to sip wine delicately. She drank whiskey straight and often. Friends joked that if Ava showed up at a party barefoot, it wasn't for glamour. It was because shoes slowed her down on the way to the bar. Her marriage to Sinatra was a stormy, alcohol-fueled roller coaster, with public blow-ups followed by equally public reconciliations. When the marriage ended, Ava didn't slow down. She moved to Spain, where she fell in with a crowd of bullfighters, writers, and fellow expats who knew how to drink until dawn. Ernest Hemingway was a close friend, and the two reportedly shared more than a few epic benders. Ava's drinking wasn't about self-destruction in the traditional sense. It was part of her defiance of the nice girl image the studios tried to force on her. She swore, she drank, she lived exactly as she pleased. But by the 1970s, years of hard living began to take a toll. She developed emphysema and suffered a stroke in 1986. Even then, she was unrepentant, telling friends she lived life her way and wouldn't change a thing. Ava Gardner's drinking never defined her the way it did some stars, but it was inseparable from her legend. She was the woman who could outdrink most men in Hollywood and look like a goddess doing it. Buster Keaton's face was famous for never breaking into a smile, the great stone face of silent film comedy. Behind the stoic expression, he was a creative genius who revolutionized slapstick, performing jaw-dropping stunts in classics like The General and Sherlock Jr. But by the early 1930s, Keaton's career and his health had been derailed by a relentless drinking problem. His troubles started after the transition to talkies. MGM signed him, but the studio system stifled his creativity, assigning him to formulaic comedies that stripped away his inventive style. Keaton, feeling trapped, turned to alcohol. His binges became legendary. He once disappeared for days, waking up in another city with no memory of how he got there. Friends described him as a quiet drunk. He didn't get violent or loud, just withdrawn, as if trying to vanish into the background. His drinking cost him his first marriage, damaged his health, and nearly ended his career. In 1935, MGM fired him, citing his unreliability. By the late 30s, he was broke, living in a small apartment and working occasional behind-the-scenes jobs just to scrape by. Keaton eventually sobered up in the 1940s, making a surprising comeback in television and cameos in films like Sunset Boulevard. But the years lost to the bottle left a shadow over his career, a what might have been story that still haunts film historians. Buster Keaton's genius was undeniable, but so was the damage alcohol inflicted on him. In old Hollywood, not even the greatest comedian could outrun the bottle. Montgomery Clift was the brooding heartthrob of the late 1940s and 50s, a method actor before method was fashionable. In films like A Place in the Sun and From Here to Eternity, he brought an intensity that made audiences believe every word. But off-screen, Clift was a deeply sensitive man, plagued by insecurities and, after 1956, chronic pain from a horrific car crash. The accident shattered his face, requiring extensive reconstructive surgery. Though he returned to acting, Clift became increasingly dependent on alcohol and pills to manage both the physical pain and the emotional toll of seeing his looks, his career's foundation, altered. Friends noted he'd arrive on set visibly drunk, or vanish into his dressing room for hours, emerging glassy-eyed but determined to finish his scenes. By the early 1960s, his career was a mix of brilliant performances and erratic behavior. Directors tolerated him because his talent was unmatched. Elizabeth Taylor, one of his closest friends, often went to bat for him to keep him employed. But his health was deteriorating rapidly. He drank heavily alone at night, sometimes watching his old films and weeping. When Clift died in 1966 at just 45, the coroner ruled it a heart attack, but his years of alcohol abuse were an undeniable factor. Actor Jack Larson later called his last decade the slowest suicide in Hollywood history. Montgomery Clift's story remains one of the most poignant cautionary tales of the Golden Age, a man whose brilliance burned bright, but was dimmed too soon by the bottle. Dean Martin was the definition of cool, the smooth voice behind That's Amore, a film star in hits like Rio Bravo, and a founding member of the Rat Pack alongside Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. On stage, he was rarely seen without a drink in hand, cracking jokes in his laid-back, slightly tipsy style. Fans adored it. Whether hosting the Dean Martin Show or headlining in Vegas, Dino always looked like he was having the time of his life. The truth was more complicated. While some insiders claim Martin exaggerated his drinking for the sake of the act, swapping real whiskey for apple juice on stage, those who knew him well said he drank plenty off stage too. His home bar was always stocked, and his parties could run until dawn. Unlike many of his peers, Martin rarely let booze interfere with work. He was famously punctual and professional, but the constant drinking still wore on his health over the decades. Martin's public image as the life of the party made it easy for audiences to ignore the toll of his habits. He was the fun drunk everyone wanted at their table, the guy who never seemed to have a hangover. By the 1980s, though, his drinking combined with years of smoking caught up with him. He slowed down his career and retreated from the spotlight, eventually dying in 1995 from respiratory failure. Dean Martin's drinking may have been part performance, part reality, but it was inseparable from his legend. In old Hollywood, he proved that sometimes the most dangerous vice is the one wrapped in charm, wit, and a perfect tuxedo. Behind the silver screen, these stars lived fast, drank hard, and left us stories just as unforgettable as their films. Their struggles remind us that Hollywood's golden glow came at a price, but their legends still shine.